We are going to react to all the times that I DNF'd a race or did not finish. So it means that you start a race and you drop out. And it's kind of a taboo thing. Like typically, if you are set to run a race and you drop out, something bad happened. So I'm going to tell the story of the 3 times that I DNF'd. And behind every DNF or not finishing a race, I always had a major breakthrough a few months later. Like anytime I dropped out of a race, a few months later, I came back faster and stronger. And let's talk about the races. The first notable DNF that I ever had was actually a pandemic race. So it was a virtual race. And it was a 100-mile global running challenge put on by OSR in the summer of 2020. So it was the middle of the pandemic, and Orchard Street Runners put on this challenge to run 100 miles. And I had a few friends that were doing this race, and they did these virtual 100-milers. My friend Mina, my friend Zandy. And so I decided I wanted to do 100 miles, and I wanted to do them on the track. So this first DNF was when I ran 76 miles before ultimately dropping out and not finishing my 100-mile challenge. But that was 50 miles more than a marathon, which is something I'd also done a marathon on the track as part of this challenge a few months before. So it was the furthest I ever ran. And even though I didn't hit 100, it was an okay DNF because I had to pull the plug. I didn't know what I was doing. I got to a point where I was so sick. You can see from some of these photos, I was keeled over, crawling. It was an amazing experience to say the least, but I did not finish that challenge. But I lived to tell the tale, so it was totally worth it. The next major DNF was actually a 10K that was in Texas, and this was in February of 2021. This was a race that I flew out to Texas to compete in. It was supposed to be this amazing opportunity to qualify for the Olympic trials. That's why a lot of people were running it. And while I trained pretty hard over the winter in New York, I just didn't hit the track enough. It was way too snowy and icy. So I really didn't know where my fitness was. I was depending way too much on my treadmill mileage to see if I could even run this thing. So I went out there, and if you look at the splits, you can see I went out the gates fast. I went out at a 5:33 pace. And it wasn't long before my heart rate started to climb. And before I knew it, I was dropping out at the 5K mark. So halfway into this 10K, I dropped out. I held my head down in shame. I was so embarrassed. My mom had come all the way down to Texas, and I came back to the car and dropped out and was so sad. But the beautiful thing about this race was that a few months later, I got some track workouts in. It was spring in New York. And then I ran another track race by the same organization in New Jersey, and that's where I ran my PR. So I ran a 34:37 just a few months later, had my redemption, and it was actually pretty amazing to see how I went from dropping out of a race to running a PR and having an amazing experience in the 10K. The last big DNF of my days as a runner was at CIM, so the California International Marathon, in December of 2021. And basically this was a marathon that I kind of entered on a whim. I don't really remember the details. I just remember thinking I want to run this marathon. I think I trained for about a month and a half. It wasn't enough time. I was totally training alone. And again, I didn't really know where my fitness was. And I was really attached to a number in my head of what I wanted to run. So when I knew that number was slipping away from me, which you can kind of see if you look at my splits, I started in the 6:14 range, and I was holding on to the mid 6:15 range for the beginning of this marathon. But then around mile 15, you see my heart rate get up to the 190s. I'm running a 6:30, and I drop out. And I remember just being in a very bad place mentally. I remember thinking that all of my self-worth was dependent on this race, of what my marathon time was going to be. It was my chance to prove myself. And I just I bugged out. I got inside my head, and I couldn't really justify finishing a race. So I didn't drop out for injury or anything like that. I dropped out because of my headspace. And ultimately, all of these DNFs had to do with like mentality over actual fitness, because I'm realizing looking back at these DNFs that you kind of just have to meet yourself where you are on the day. And I've learned that with racing experience of maybe having an A goal, a B goal, and a C goal. And you just have to find where you are on the day, see how the body's feeling, and run at that pace instead of thinking you have to run a certain pace no matter what or else. And then that leads to dropping out, which I think feels a lot worse than running a little bit slower than the time that you maybe wanted to run. So I've learned that it's better to just finish the race than to drop out. I had an experience this past winter where I was at Houston and had a terrible race. It was horrible. I was walking for most of it, but I just wanted to finish. And I'm glad I did, because I think it's just more noble and says a lot more to actually get the job done and finish what you started. And if you really don't think you can run a race, just don't start. It's that starting and like dropping that feels just terrible. So looking back, I've definitely learned a lot about races, running them, finishing them, not finishing them. And that's my episode for today. So until next time, just be fast. Just win.